In my first few days of prison life, the guard who was on night duty was a decent guy. So I asked him quite a lot of questions about my new home. In fact, I might have made some of my fellow inmates suspicious because one of the rules in prison that I didn't know yet is that any inmate who talks too much to the guards is an inmate to watch out for. But anyway, my first meeting with this guard, I told him my name. I think I even foolishly reached out my hand and I said, my name is Mac. And of course, he didn't reach his hand back and he said, yeah, I'll be calling you Parker. No offense, but that's just how things work here. And so I was learning quickly. In another one of the conversations we had, he told me, Parker, I think it was a weekend, and he said, Parker, there's probably 12 guards on this compound right now, and there's more than 800 inmates. So who do you think is running this prison? Am I running this prison? Are the guards running this prison? Or is the gang, or are the gangs running this prison? And I had to admit that it sounded like the gangs would be running the prison. And I came to learn that, like a lot of things that people said in prison, both guards and inmates, some of it was about expressing their own fear, and some of it was about trying to instill fear in you. But in any case, here I was, an old white guy from the boondocks of Vermont, in a whole new world. How the hell was I supposed to live here? What was this going to be like? I wasn't particularly afraid. I was more curious and interested because this was a world growing up in North Danville, Vermont that I did not know much about. And I have to say, this is a touchy subject, but I'm not a big fan of how the term white privilege is used in our cultural conversation these days. I fully understand that in a culture with our history, it's essential to understand the roots of slavery and the oppression of Black people and the oppression of Latino people and how these things operate. But my impression, maybe I'll talk more about that another time, but it's an important thing to understand. But my experience of how most, especially liberal progressive people, use the term is as a way to perpetually make themselves small and guilty, as though white people are kind of like that puppy that skulks around the house because it can't quite keep itself from peeing on the rug, looking ashamed of itself, looking guilty, looking like it's about to get hit, looking like it's trying to be loved. And I just don't think that's a great way to try to solve the issues of racism and divisiveness that are so prevalent in our culture. And frankly, I won't go into detail about this, but I think it's a way that people on the left and liberal democratic circles lose a lot of white working people, because who the hell wants to be told that the right way to be is to always be guilty and ashamed of yourself? Of course, we have to take account for what we have done and what we do and what's been instilled in us and the history of our culture. But the answer to things is not guilt and shame and trying to make yourself small so that someone else can be raised up. So I did have a certain kind of privilege or access or opportunity in prison that not everyone had. I was an older white guy who had grown up in a culture in Vermont that wasn't that different from the culture in the Adirondacks where Raybrook Federal Correctional Institution is located. I knew the guys who were the guards. I'd known guys like them all my life. I'd played sports with them. And, I too when I was younger, I'd gone hunting and worked in the woods and all kinds of things like that. So I had a kind of familiarity and access and ability to talk with these guys that people from inner city New York or Chicago or Atlanta or Texas or whatever didn't have. So I decided I was going to, if I had a kind of privilege here, I was going to use it. And so I did. I spoke up for people every chance I got. I remember, I think I told a short version of the story in another video. I met a guy in the education center one night, a black guy who was standing outside a classroom watching the class going on inside. And he said, I was in the class, I think, and he said, so how's the class going? And I said, oh, it's really good. And he said, yeah, a friend of mine's teaching it. And he was kind of mentoring this guy in teaching a class. I don't even remember what it was about, but it was a good class. And I thanked him and I said, so how come you can't teach it yourself? And he told me this whole story about how he had been in a prison somewhere down south, and he had worked with a woman, a guard in the education center, a guard teacher. You're a guard first in prison, whether you're a teacher or whatever, or you work in the kitchen or whatever. And he had worked with this woman in education, and as happens more often than people like to admit in prison, they kind of fell in love and became very attached to each other and close to each other. And one day she came in and she had a black eye. She was all bruised up, and he said, what happened? And come to find out that, of course, she had been beaten up by her husband. But the wrinkle in the story was that her husband was the SIS, the Special Investigative Services lieutenant at that prison. And so my friend, this was Cedric Dean, my friend kind of freaked out, and I don't know all the details of what happened, but I think he reported this lieutenant, reporting him for abusing his wife, and then probably the story about these two, an inmate and a guard, which is totally taboo in prison, even though it happens, being closer to each other than anybody thought they should be, came out. And so, of course, I seriously doubt that the SIS lieutenant got punished, but Cedric Dean certainly did. And part of his punishment was he was yanked out of that prison and he was sent to Raybrook, way the hell up in northern New York State, away from his family, away from his community, away from everything he had known. And I knew he had been blacklisted. He told me they wouldn't let him teach classes. He was a very smart guy. They wouldn't let him teach classes or do anything in education. So I said, well, let me see what I can do about that. Because I was working as a visiting room orderly at the time, and I saw the SIS lieutenant walking through the visiting room every day. He was younger, the SIS lieutenant was younger than I was, but he was a guy. He was a rural guy. He was a guy like thousands of guys I've known growing up. And we would talk, and we'd talk about this and talk about that. And he knew me, and he said I did a good job cleaning the visiting room. And so I made an appointment to go talk with the SIS lieutenant, which is considered a dangerous thing to do, but I wanted to talk to him about Cedric. So I went and I told him the whole story. I said, look, this guy found... you're the SIS lieutenant here. You can imagine what happens if this guy reports the SIS lieutenant from another prison, in another prison for abusing his wife. You and I both know damn well what's going to happen to that guy. And he's being blackballed on this compound, and you and I also both know what's right. He doesn't deserve that. And if there's anything you can do to speak up for him, to get his get him off this blacklist and let him teach and let him take classes and let him be active on the compound, I would appreciate it. And he did. He did. And so I used the access that I had. I used the privilege that I had. I did this. I tried to do this in every way that I could. When my friend Bird was trying to get a reduction in sentence, he didn't really know how to go about it, so I researched it with him, and I talked with people, and I ended up writing him a letter of recommendation as a fellow inmate, saying how much Bird had changed and how much he'd been transformed by his experience in prison. And the year after I got out, Bird got out of prison. And in every case that I could, in every instance that I could, I tried to, if you want to call it white privilege, call it white privilege. But if it's something that I had, I wanted to use it. And I did that in every way and in every instance I could. The first and most basic was just treating everybody with respect. Being a white man who treated black men with respect, period. Who treated Hispanic men with respect, period. No matter what. Of course, I'd be honest with them if I disagreed with them. If I was pissed off with them, I'd tell them. But I treated them with respect. I remember there was a young man in prison. It's not a politically correct place, and in prison you're either white, you're black, or you're Spanish. That's just, you speak Spanish, you're Spanish. It doesn't matter if you're from Guatemala or Mexico. You're white, you're black, or you're Spanish. But anyway, this was a Spanish guy in my unit, and he came to me. I'd been talking to him, getting to know him little by little, and one day he came to me. Actually, he came to me and asked me if I would go talk to him in his cell. He had something private he wanted to talk to me about. And so I said, sure. So I went to his cell, and he was very ashamed of himself and very timid, but he said, "Parker, I can't read." And it was such a vulnerable thing for him to say, and I was so touched by it. And he said, "I was wondering, I'd really like to get my GED, and I'm wondering if you could help me." So I did. And it didn't turn out that I knew him long enough to know how far he got out shortly thereafter. So I don't know how far he got, but it was like, yes, if I can do this, if I have a privilege, a capacity, an ability that you don't have, whether it's freedom to speak to the guards or the authorities, or something that I've learned in my culture that maybe you didn't get a chance to learn in yours, I'm damn well going to use it. And the way people use white privilege, the analogy in our culture that drives me crazy, it's the analogy I use. It's like if you had an SUV, a big, powerful SUV with winter tires and a tow chain in your back, and you come across somebody stuck in the ditch. What white privilege tends to do is pull over and say, white privilege as we practice it. In liberal circles today, we pull over in our SUV next to the vehicle that's stuck in the ditch, and we say, "Oh, I'm so sorry you're stuck in the ditch. I feel so guilty about it. I wish there was something I could do." And then we drive off and leave them in the ditch. I said, if you got a damn SUV, help the person out of the ditch. Use what you got. Take the chain out of the back, hook it onto their vehicle, pull it out, and let's both go on together. I knew a family, a husband and wife, who were very wealthy here, and for some reason, I was having conversation with them about my time in prison, and the woman reached out to me by email, and she said that the woman who cleaned her house, her boyfriend or husband or something, was in prison, and what could she do to help? And I said, well, I don't know if he has a prison job, but it's often hard to get, food from the commissary, if you don't have a source of income or people who are supporting you, or you don't have access to somebody who can send you books that you want to get, or whatever, you could reach out to her and ask how she could help. And a few days later, she sent me an email, and she was very proud of herself, and she said, I thank you so much for our conversation. I really learned a lot, and that meant a lot to me. And I put an extra $10 in the paycheck of my housekeeper so she could send it on to her boyfriend or husband in prison. $10. These people are multi-millionaires. She sent $10. That's what guilt does. Guilt doesn't really help people. It's not powerful. It's an icky, ashamed, closed in, well, what can I do to help? In other words, how can I not feel so guilty about myself? Instead of occupying your strength, whatever it is, and offering it to people in a helpful way. And that's what I tried to do in prison. And if we have something that someone else doesn't have in this culture, in these hard times, whether it's in prison or whether it's in our communities, let's damn well use it to help people. Let's not just sit around feeling guilty or endlessly making ourselves small. Let's use it. Let's have meaningful, helpful connections and relationships with each other. That's what I tried to do in prison, and that's one of the many valuable things I learned while I was there. Thank you so much for watching. If you like these, I'm so grateful for the comments that I'm getting from people about these. It really touches me. Thank you for watching. Please do like and subscribe. It's one way, it's the most tangible way you can support this channel and get these stories in front of more people. Thanks for watching. I hope to see you again very soon. Thank you.